Thank you, Alistair, and great to be here this morning. As Alistair mentioned, I run our business across UK, Ireland, and Nordics. The theme of today's conference is about corporate innovation and evolution. I've been at Uber coming up on 3 years, and certainly can say from my personal experience that the journey we've gone through over the last few years embodies both of those. And wanted to tell you a little bit today about that journey, particularly here in the UK. The idea for Uber was originally conceived, as some of you may have heard, in Paris. Our founders, Travis Kalanick and Garrett Camp, were in Paris in winter 7 years ago or so at Le Web conference. And as many of you may have found, hopefully before the advent of Uber, getting a car late at night in Paris or even in London could be quite difficult. And they thought, wouldn't it be nice if you could just get a car at the touch of a button? And so the idea was born. And initially, it was a very high-end car service to a fairly small group of people in San Francisco that you could get a car to get you from A to B. The concept's very simple. Hopefully, by this stage, almost all of you have tried Uber. When I first joined, I had to explain that to everyone. But essentially, you download the app, you sign up and get your profile. And then when you want to travel, you simply open it up. You can see where the nearest available cars are, choose your different services. At the tap of a button, a car's on its way to you. You get past the name, photo, and registration of the driver, and you can watch them drive up in the app. And then you get in and go to where you need to go. And at the end, you get out. You don't need to pay. Well, you pay through your credit card, so there's no dealing with cash at the end of that. And importantly, at the end, you rate your driver. And as probably most of you know by now, your driver also rates you, which has been an important part in increasing the safety and accountability of the service. The drivers using the platform all work with us on a completely flexible and non-exclusive basis, so they can work with us as much or as little as they want, whenever they want. Here in the UK, all of those drivers, of course, have the same private hire licensing and background checks as the rest of the industry. And in terms of our journey in London, we launched back in 2012, just around the time of the Olympics, with a luxury high-end car service called Uber Lux. And that was reasonably successful. We were able to get people at the touch of a button from A to B. And around the world, our service grew. The first international city outside of San Francisco and the US markets was Paris, given that's where the idea was born, and London soon after. But what we realized is that it was only a fairly small demographic that really were able to use a long wheelbase S-Class Mercedes. And so we saw there was demand for the same simple and convenient service at a much more affordable price. And so in 2013 in the UK, we launched our UberX service. Exactly the same experience, but this time in a Toyota Prius or equivalent. And because of the efficiency of the system, we were actually able to drive down the prices not only cheaper than our black executive car, but also actually cheaper than many other private hire and taxi options. Because you book the car when you need it, the efficiency of the system is such that the drivers aren't waiting around. And although the price may be lower per trip, at the end of a shift, the drivers are earning as much or more as they would with other competitors. So UberX, for example, here in London, is around 30 to 50% cheaper than most of the other taxi and car options that you can get. And that opened up traveling by a private car to a much bigger demographic. And once we launched that lower cost service, we saw huge expansion around the world. And we only launched Uber just over 5 years ago. We're now in more than 65 countries, 400 cities around the world. And those are not just the Western world developed cities you'd imagine in the US and Western Europe. You can use the exact same app in Bogota, in Delhi, in Johannesburg, in Riyadh. You can open up the same app with the same payment profile and account, and get a reliable and safe ride at the touch of a button within minutes. And Uber globally is now doing 5 million journeys every day around the world. And of course, to be able to operate in such diverse range of cities, we've had to constantly evolve the service in each of those cities that we operate in. Whether that's launching different payment types in sub-Saharan Africa, where of course credit card penetration is much lower, or it's finding different ways for riders and drivers to communicate together in India, or it's solving the complex mapping issues in China. We've continually evolved the product. To give you a scale of the growth in London, an example of the journey we've been through, what you can see here is a map of the GPS trails of cars in London. And these are taken from a Monday in April in 2013 and each year through to 2016. And obviously you can see in 2013 we were really just focused on central London. But as the business has grown, it's grown not only in size, but also in the geography and the area that it covers. You can now get a car within about 3 minutes across most of Greater London. You can see there on the right. And that's enabled people to get a car often in areas that are less well served by public transport. Outside of zones 1 and 2, about 20% of the Uber trips start or end in areas that you could think of as being less well served. They're more than half a mile from a public transportation station. And that's when we also started to see that Uber's becoming a complement to public transport. This is a map of trips in outer London on a March sort of Monday morning between 5 and 10 a.m. that started or finished at a tube stop. And so what you see is a lot of people are using services like Uber as the first or last mile to help them get to where they're going. And part of Uber's ambition, as we've seen the impact that we've been able to have in cities like that, is actually to remove the need for private car ownership. If you can open up your smartphone and at the touch of a button have a range of transportation options available to you, whether it's the tube or the bus, whether it's a taxi, all the different types of car available from Uber, Boris Bike, Walk, you can even get a Zip car if you need to drive yourself. Once you have that huge range of mobility options, you no longer feel the need, hopefully, to own a private car. And that's something we're starting to see, at least anecdotally, across the US and now finally in the UK, that people are selling their second car, maybe not even having to have a first car. But then as we looked at the greater impact that Uber could have on cities, one challenge most cities, London included, faces is obviously traffic and congestion and emissions. And we started thinking, what if you could get more people into fewer cars so that you can make better use of the cars that you have on the road? And that was the concept behind Uberpool. We looked at a lot of the data that we had in cities like London, and we saw that a large number of the trips were almost matching, duplicate trips of people starting and finishing their journey in similar places. And that's the concept behind Uberpool. Instead of having two people who are going on separate, independent trips from similar areas to a similar destination, with Uberpool, you're actually able to combine those two trips if the passenger so wishes. And the driver picks up first one passenger, then the other, and then drops them both off at their destination. It's obviously a hugely complex problem to make sure that the inconvenience factor isn't too big and that all of the mapping and routing works. But what it means is that customers can get a ride at 25% cheaper than the UberX service here in London, that drivers are more efficient and productive because they've got two fares in the car at the same time, and that we're making much better use of the assets, the cars that are on the road. And that obviously has benefits for emissions and for traffic congestion. Now, I mean, here in London, I have to admit, as a Brit, I was always a little bit skeptical about how well this service would take off. I know a lot of my friends who would probably pay a little bit extra to avoid any potential social awkwardness from sharing a car with a fellow Uber pooler. But we launched Uber Pool in London 6 months ago, right at the end of last year. And coincidentally, when we looked at the data this week, able to share that actually since then, Londoners have chosen to share their Uber journey over 1 million times using Uber Pool. And obviously that's just early days, but starts to enable some real benefits in cities like London. In just those 6 months, what we've seen is that there's 700 miles have been saved. That's miles where people would have been traveling in one car on their own, but it's combined with someone else. That's saved 52,000 litres of petrol, and therefore 124 metric tons of CO2. Helping to make the cities a better place. That's over 60 tons worth of coal that would have had to be burnt to enable those emissions. And it's still early days, but really excited by the potential that services like this could bring. We don't just have them again in developed markets like in the UK and the US. We've actually launched Uber Pool in cities like Jakarta, Mexico City, and several cities across India and China, where the exact same service is operating and helping to reduce some of those challenges in the city. Interestingly, over 3 million people have used Uber Pool as their first ever Uber trip, which tells me two things. One is that we're actually able to appeal to a demographic that we otherwise couldn't reach before because the service was maybe too expensive. But also that people are adapting socially to the new normal of sharing assets like a car. But taking it back to the theme here today about corporate innovation and evolution, wanted to think about what a couple of the themes that we would take away from our experience with Uber, and I think there's 3 of them. Firstly, this ability and desire even to always disrupt yourself. When we first started talking about UberX, there could have been concern that it would actually cannibalize our luxury business, which is still available today, by the way, if you wanted a car home. And the same with Uber Pool. It's cheaper than UberX. Won't that cannibalize our existing business? But I think our thinking was that if we don't do it, someone else will do it. And the only way to keep innovating is to always be testing and challenging ourselves and what we're already offering. I think, secondly, that innovation has to happen at every single level. One of the really interesting things about Uber is it's an incredibly decentralized structure. We have small teams in every single city in which we operate around the world. And that means that we're able to be incredibly agile and nimble when we want to roll new things out. But it also means that innovation can come at every level. It's not just the product and engineering guys sitting in HQ who are innovating. It's everybody, whether it's someone improving an operational process for how we support drivers, or my colleagues in Nairobi coming up for an idea with how we could solve some of the payment issues that they were experiencing in Kenya. And we look for and encourage that type of innovation at every level. And maybe one of the ideas for the next big thing, next Uber Pool, will come from one of these cities here in the UK. But to be able to do that, the only way you can allow that amount of decentralization and autonomy is to have a very clear and unifying vision or mission. For Uber, our vision is to provide transportation as reliable as running water everywhere and for everyone. And eventually, what we hope is that removes the need for private car ownership. And that means that all the teams that are working independently around the world still have that very clear objective of finding cheaper and more efficient ways for people to move around their city from A to B. And if we come back here to London, I mean, we've seen a really exciting journey over the last 3-4 years that we've been in the city. And we've moved from being able to get a luxury car at the touch of a button to now the technology allowing us to really have carpooling where people can share cars and reduce the number of cars on the road. But when we look ahead, we see that in London still more than 1 million people drive into work every day. So there's still an enormous challenge as the city grows of how we make sure everyone can continue to move around the city efficiently and effectively. And so we're really excited to hopefully be part of the solution there as we look forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I will just kick off with one question, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Very quickly, I mean, you're on the forefront of disruption, and of course, in your case, that's triggered some political issues, including the UK. Can you just share a little bit of your experiences about that, and how you've kind of dealt with that, and where do you foresee more political opposition in the UK, for example?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think essentially Uber's bringing competition to an area that actually hasn't necessarily seen in the UK that much competition for quite a long time. It's also bringing technology to a sector where most of the regulations were actually created before the advent of smartphones and Google Maps. I mean, here in London, the last laws were written in 1998. And so not only are the incumbents and existing industry players that have had to react to that, but also regulators and governments around the world are having to figure out how do we understand and interpret this regulation in light of new technology. And so given the rapid growth that we've seen, there has been some challenges and disruption. I think overall competition is good. It's good for the consumer, as we all know, but it's also good for the drivers because it's bringing them another opportunity, another economic opportunity, and it makes us and all competitors raise our game. We ultimately don't think it's Uber or all of the existing services, but it's with a combination of those that you can actually take away private car ownership.
Thank you. Does anyone have a question? I'm sure someone has a question. The gentleman over there, if you could just wait on the microphone and then tell us who you are and which organisation you work for. Thank you.
Hi, yes. My name's Matt Williams. I work for a company called Made by Many. We do digital innovation stuff. One question I've noticed about services like Uber, Airbnb, you use Google Maps for your mapping service. Do you think you're over-reliant on that? What happens if Google pulls the plug, changes their terms, that kind of thing? I mean, a lot of people here who might want to do something really innovative might be relying on such third-party services. How do you mitigate that kind of risk?
It's a great question. I mean, I think, I'm probably not the most technical person on this, but I think we deal actually not just with Google Maps, but also with Apple Maps. You may also have read that we acquired a mapping group from Bing. And so it's something we were always working on. I'm not sure what our exact strategy is, but to exactly eliminate those single points of failure that you point out. But also to be as global as we are, you actually have to rely on a range of mapping solutions, because if you go and try and use Google Maps in Cairo, for example, or in Beijing, we used to find in the early days the driver would end up 2 kilometers away from where the passenger was. So it's something our teams are always working on refining.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question. The gentleman over there, please. If you could just tell us who you are. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tim Jones from Tivado Digital Cash. And my question is about driverless cars. So we all know they're flying around in California. I'd just be interested in your view on, the biggest cost in your car is the driver. So getting rid of it obviously has economic attraction. Do you think it's practical? On what time scale? How fast? Where first?
It's a question we get a lot. I think it's still a long way off. There's still a number of challenges around both technological challenges, but also regulatory challenges. How do you sort out who has liability in the case of an accident, adoption, and things like that. Obviously, we're very keen to be part of the technological future in this, as with anything else. But there's still quite a long way to go, we think, a number of years or decades. If you compare to the mobile phone, it was actually probably around 10 or 15 years before it had widespread use and adoption. And something like driverless cars is also probably even more complicated than that. But we'll watch and wait and see.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Joe. Thanks.
Thank you.